My name is Hazel, and by the time I turned 19 I had already done something that shocked everyone I knew. I married a man 3 times my age, 60 years old, silver hair, expensive suits, a smile that carried both wisdom and secrets. His name was Richard, and he wasn't just older, he was rich. Not comfortable rich, but the kind of rich where people lowered their voices when they said his name. Now, before you roll your eyes or judge me, let me take you back. Let me explain why a 19-year-old girl like me would say yes to a man old enough to be my grandfather. Trust me, the story isn't what you think. It's not just about gold digging or daddy issues, or some desperate attempt to escape my past. No, what happened between Richard and me turned into something much darker, much more twisted, and it ended in a way I never saw coming. I grew up in a small town where people didn't dream very big. My mother worked 2 jobs, my father was gone before I learned how to spell his name, and I was the girl everyone expected would either marry some local guy or disappear into a dead-end job. But I was different. I wanted more. I wanted out. I wanted power. When I met Richard, it wasn't some random accident. I was working as a hostess at a luxury restaurant just outside the city. It was the kind of place where everyone wore tailored clothes and spoke in low voices over glasses of $100 wine. One night he walked in, a man who carried the room without saying a word. His silver hair was slicked back, his cufflinks sparkled, and when he looked at me, it felt like he saw more than just a teenage girl handing out menus. He ordered a table for one, but by the end of the night I knew he wasn't someone you forgot. He left me a tip so large I thought it was a mistake, and tucked inside was a card with just his name and a number. That was how it started. He didn't pursue me like boys my age did with clumsy texts and cheap flowers. No, Richard knew how to pull someone into his world. His first gift was a book. Yes, a book, wrapped in delicate paper. Inside was a handwritten note. For a girl who looks like she already knows there's more to life than this town. That line hooked me. Because he was right. Our conversations were intoxicating. He'd tell me stories about places he'd traveled, about the business world, about art and history. He made me feel like I'd been living in black and white, and suddenly he was offering me color. When he finally asked me to dinner, I said yes without hesitation. The whispers started soon after. My coworkers laughed behind my back, my mom told me it was dangerous, and my friends, well, most of them stopped being friends. They called me naive. Some called me a gold digger. But none of them understood what it felt like to have someone look at you like you mattered, like you weren't destined for a life of scraping by. When Richard proposed, it was nothing like I had imagined as a little girl. No kneeling, no nervous stammer. He simply took me to a penthouse overlooking the city, poured me a glass of champagne and said, "Hazel, I'd like you by my side permanently. As my wife." It wasn't romantic. It was businesslike, almost cold. But the ring sparkled like a promise, and the life he offered seemed too good to refuse. So I didn't. I said yes. For a while it felt like a dream. We traveled to places I'd only seen in movies. I had clothes, jewelry, and a credit card with no limit. I posted smiling photos online, pretending everything was perfect. People envied me. Strangers thought I was the luckiest girl alive. And I let them think that. But behind the luxury there were cracks. Richard was charming in public, but in private he was calculating. He wasn't cruel, not at first, but he was controlling. Where I went, who I spoke to, what I wore, it all seemed to matter to him. He never yelled. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. His approval was currency, and I was always desperate to earn it. I told myself it was worth it. That I could live with the unease in exchange for the life he gave me. After all, what 19-year-old could say she lived in a mansion, attended galas, and flew private? But then little things started happening. Whispers from staff I wasn't supposed to hear. Documents left on his desk that didn't add up. Late-night phone calls where he'd lower his voice and leave the room. At first I ignored it. I wanted to believe my life was a fairy tale. But a fairy tale doesn't come with locked doors and secrets that slip out in fragments. One night, while Richard was away on a business trip, I wandered through his study. My curiosity had grown too heavy to ignore. I opened drawers I'd been told never to touch. And what I found made my stomach twist into knots. Bank statements. Transfers. Names I didn't recognize. Money moving in and out like a storm, some of it connected to charities I'd seen him donate to in public. Others went to offshore accounts. And then there was the envelope, tucked deep in the drawer. My name was on it. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were documents that listed debts. Debts in my name. That was the first night I realized I wasn't a wife. I was a pawn. And that was just the beginning of what I was about to discover. The night I found those documents with debts in my name, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might wake the entire mansion. My hands shook as I clutched the papers, whispering to myself over and over, "This can't be real. There's no way. He wouldn't do this to me." But deep down I already knew he would. Because Richard wasn't the kind of man who made mistakes. He was the kind of man who made moves. Calculated, precise moves. The next morning I tried to act normal. I slid the papers back into the envelope, returned it to the drawer, and pretended I hadn't seen anything. Richard came home that afternoon, smiling, placing a diamond bracelet in my hand like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. "Missed you, Hazel," he said, kissing my forehead. And I smiled back even though my stomach churned. I had to be careful. If he knew I'd snooped, I didn't know what he'd do. Days turned into weeks and I became a silent observer in my own life. I noticed how his phone was always face down on the table. How he'd disappear into his study for hours. How he'd take calls on the balcony late at night. And most of all, how he always looked at me like he was measuring something. My loyalty, my silence, maybe both. Then came the night that changed everything. Richard had told me he was flying to Miami for a business meeting. His tone was casual, but something about the way he avoided my eyes made me suspicious. After he left, I couldn't shake the gnawing in my gut. So I did something I'd never dared before. I followed him. The night I found those documents with debts in my name, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might wake the entire mansion. My hands shook as I clutched the papers, whispering to myself over and over, "This can't be real. There's no way. He wouldn't do this to me." But deep down I already knew he would. Because Richard wasn't the kind of man who made mistakes. He was the kind of man who made moves. Calculated, precise moves. The next morning I tried to act normal. I slid the papers back into the envelope, returned it to the drawer, and pretended I hadn't seen anything. Richard came home that afternoon, smiling, placing a diamond bracelet in my hand like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. "Missed you, Hazel," he said, kissing my forehead. And I smiled back even though my stomach churned. I had to be careful. If he knew I'd snooped, I didn't know what he'd do. Days turned into weeks and I became a silent observer in my own life. I noticed how his phone was always face down on the table. How he'd disappear into his study for hours. How he'd take calls on the balcony late at night. And most of all, how he always looked at me like he was measuring something. My loyalty, my silence, maybe both. Then came the night that changed everything. Richard had told me he was flying to Miami for a business meeting. His tone was casual, but something about the way he avoided my eyes made me suspicious. After he left, I couldn't shake the gnawing in my gut. So I did something I'd never dared before. I followed him. I waited an hour, then called a cab and went straight to the airport. I didn't have a ticket, but I knew how to watch. I saw him, not boarding a plane but sliding into a sleek black car just outside the terminal. My chest tightened as I jumped into another cab and whispered, "Follow that car." The ride felt endless. My hands were clammy, my heart in my throat. Finally, the car pulled up in front of a luxury hotel downtown. I leaned forward, eyes wide. Richard stepped out, and so did a woman. She was stunning. Young, probably around my age, with flowing dark hair and a laugh that carried across the pavement. Richard's hand brushed hers, quick but deliberate, before they disappeared inside together. I felt the world tilt. My throat closed. I wanted to scream, to cry, to storm after them, but I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures, my hands trembling so badly the first ones were blurry. I steadied myself, focusing, capturing every damning detail. His hand on her back, the way he leaned close, the way he smiled at her like he used to smile at me. Hours later, I sat outside the hotel, my stomach empty, my heart shredded. When they finally emerged, laughing, her lipstick smudged, his tie loosened, it wasn't just betrayal I felt. It was confirmation. My marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a performance. And I was the fool on stage. Back home I couldn't even look at him. But I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead I became someone else. Someone quieter. Someone who watched, learned, and waited. I started digging deeper into his life. While he slept, I searched his study. I found more offshore accounts, more documents with my name signed on loans I'd never agreed to, more evidence of his careful, deliberate plan to ruin me financially while he played the role of the loving, respectable husband. But the most shocking discovery came one rainy afternoon. I was in the library flipping through books when I noticed a gap in the shelf. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed lightly on the wood and to my shock the panel clicked open. Inside was a safe. My pulse quickened. Took me 3 nights to figure out the code. And when it finally swung open I almost collapsed. Inside were stacks of cash, passports under different names and, my breath caught, photographs. Dozens of them. Some of me, candid shots from before we were married. Me walking home from work. Me sitting at a bus stop. Me reading at the cafe. He had been watching me long before I ever knew him. My knees buckled and I sat on the floor, the photos spilling around me. All this time I thought I had chosen him. But the truth was he had chosen me. He had been studying me, preparing me, grooming me to play the part in his carefully crafted game. That night when he came to bed and kissed my cheek, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Because now I knew. Richard wasn't just unfaithful. He wasn't just a liar. He was dangerous. And if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to protect myself, I needed to become just as dangerous as him. 4 weeks after opening that safe, I lived like a ghost inside my own home. I floated through the hallways, smiled when Richard looked, and played the part of the devoted young wife. But inside I was drowning. Every photograph I'd seen haunted me. The idea that he'd been following me, studying me long before our romance began, it made my skin crawl. I'd thought I was in control, thought I was choosing a future, but the truth was I'd been chosen. Trapped like a bird in a gilded cage, too blinded by the shine to notice the bars. At night when Richard slept, I would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at his face in the shadows. My chest burned with conflicting emotions. Hatred, fear, betrayal, but also shame. Shame that I'd let myself fall for it. That I'd ignored the signs. That I'd been so desperate for escape, for luxury, for power, that I hadn't asked myself what it might cost me. Some nights I cried quietly into the pillow, biting down on the sheets so he wouldn't hear. Other nights I whispered to myself, "You're stronger than this. You have to be." And then one night a new thought slipped into my mind. A dangerous one. What if I stopped being the victim? What if, instead of waiting for him to ruin me, I turned the game around? That thought grew slowly at first, like a seed planted in darkness. But the more I watered it with my anger, my heartbreak, my humiliation, the stronger it became. Until one morning I woke up, looked at myself in the mirror and whispered, "Hazel, it's time to fight back." But fighting Richard wasn't like fighting some foolish boy my age. He was powerful, connected, careful. If I struck too soon I'd lose everything. I needed patience. I needed precision. I needed to be the version of me he never saw coming. So I started planning. The first step was information. I went back to the safe, back to the study, and began copying everything: bank records, loan agreements, photographs. I bought a small flash drive and stored digital scans of every document I could find. I hid it in a place Richard would never look. Inside the lining of one of my old teddy bears from childhood, tucked away in a box of sentimental junk he had no interest in. The second step was allies. Carefully I began talking to the staff, the housekeeper, the driver, even the gardener. I never asked direct questions, but I listened. I smiled. I built trust. And slowly stories started to slip through. Stories of other women Richard had brought to hotels. Stories of mysterious shipments delivered late at night. Stories of men in suits arriving for meetings that never made it into his calendar. One afternoon, while the housekeeper folded linens beside me, she lowered her voice and whispered, "Be careful, Miss Hazel. Men like him, they don't let go easy." Her words echoed in my mind for days. Because she was right. The third step was patience. I couldn't just confront him, couldn't just scream and demand answers. No, Richard thrived on control. If I showed my cards, he'd bury me before I had a chance to move. So I became an actress. I kissed him when he wanted, laughed at his jokes, pretended I was the same naive girl who once thought his wealth was the answer to all my problems. But beneath the mask, I was sharpening my weapons. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The nights he left the house, the women I saw him with, the lies he told me. Every entry was another brick in the foundation of the revenge I was building. Still, the hardest part wasn't the planning. It was the waiting. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to throw the photographs in his face, to ask him how he could stand there and call me darling after planting debts in my name. But I held back. I reminded myself that revenge wasn't about rage. It was about patience. About letting him believe he'd already won. The turning point came one evening at a gala. Richard was in his element, shaking hands, laughing with politicians and businessmen, showing me off like a prize. I stood beside him, my diamond necklace glittering under the chandeliers, and for the first time I didn't feel like his ornament. I felt like his executioner in disguise. That night as we drove home, Richard leaned over and said, "Hazel, you make me proud." I turned to him, smiled sweetly and replied, "And you make me feel safe." He smiled, satisfied, never realizing the lie dripping from my lips. But inside I wasn't safe. I was dangerous. And soon he would find out just how dangerous I could be. I'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in my head, the way you rehearse a speech that will change your life. But rehearsing and doing are different things. The first step of my plan was simple. Make him comfortable, then pull the floor out from under him. I started where he thought no one would look. His pride. Richard loved being seen. He loved the applause, the invitations, the respect. He had built a life where people assumed his halo was earned. If I could show the cracks in that halo, the rest would follow. So I dressed for charm and smiled for cameras. I posted photos of us at dinners, of me laughing at his jokes, of him holding my hand like he'd always held it. The world still thought we were perfect. Inside I was collecting proof. The private investigator I'd hired had been discreet, almost invisible. She'd trailed him for weeks, and the report she delivered to me felt like a weapon wrapped in velvet. Hotel receipts, cab logs, timestamps that matched the photographs I'd taken that night in Miami. A pattern emerged. A sequence of meetings in cities where his businesses supposedly had no operations. Transfers to accounts under names that meant nothing until Marcus, the forensic accountant, connected them to companies used as funnels. Marcus had a talent for finding the single thread that unraveled the sweater. "He's sloppy where he thinks it counts," Marcus told me. "He protects the fancy stuff and hides the ugly under layers. People like him forget that paper trails leak." With Claire and Marcus, I built our pressure points. We filed motions to compel disclosure of assets. We petitioned to have suspicious accounts frozen. I let the legal machine turn, slow and precise, and while it did, I moved on the social front. The first public blow was subtle but devastating. I reached out to a charity Richard had been involved with for years. The kind that loved glossy photos of donors' smiling faces. I didn't fling accusations. I presented questions. I handed them receipts that didn't add up, vendor names that didn't exist, invoices that looked like they'd been printed in someone's basement. The foundation panicked when Marcus explained the forensic trail. They convened an emergency board meeting and within days released a statement. They were conducting an internal audit and suspending all upcoming events tied to Richard. I watched him on the news, face pale, measured, mouthing innocence like lines from a script. The invitations thinned. The handshakes became shorter. A man who'd never known hesitation felt the floor tilt beneath him. It was small. It was public. It was beginning to hurt. But I wanted him to hurt where he thought it couldn't be harmed. His reputation as a man of the world, a patron of the arts, a father who was adored. For the first of my personal strikes, I arranged for a journalist, one who had covered financial scandals and didn't fall for charm, to meet with me. I gave them the timelines, the documents, the photos. I didn't want sensationalism. I wanted facts to land in places that mattered. Investor meetings, boardrooms, front pages. When the story ran, it was surgical. Not a tabloid screed, but a careful piece that traced money to shell companies and showed, with dates and receipts, how donations had been misallocated. The city's elite read it over breakfast and sighed. People began to call Richard's office with questions, and his assistant returned calls with fewer answers than before. He sat in his study and watched his world crumble in a way a man who'd built a life on perception could not bear. Still, I didn't expose everything. I kept a reserve of evidence, quiet and lethal, for the moments when he would retaliate. And he did retaliate. Predictably, he filed for an injunction claiming invasion of privacy. He tried to smear the PI's reports as fabrications, called Claire's motions reckless. In filings that smelled of desperation, he accused me of extortion. I felt the old panic, that animal surge in my chest, but Claire had already walked those halls before. She prepared counter-motions, called witnesses, produced bank logs. Marcus testified in depositions with a calm I envied, explaining in plain language how transfers had been routed. The judge sees patterns even if people prefer not to. While the legal tide turned, I set another trap. I knew Richard prided himself on control of the narrative, of people, of outcomes. He'd planted loyalty in his inner circle, hired yes-men, decorated his life with the right names. If I could get one of those names to crack, the rest might follow. So I started with a slip. I invited a woman from his charity's board over for tea, a woman who had always smiled at him and lived in the same circles. I was charming. I was interested. I let her talk. People reveal themselves when they believe you admire them. She did. She told me stories about Richard's generosity, about the special projects he liked to fund. She also mentioned a contractor who'd never been paid. I fed that seed. A call to that contractor, just a polite inquiry, turned into a conversation of anger and betrayal. He had receipts, statements, witnesses. He'd been waiting for someone to ask. Once that conversation started, it didn't stop. Contractors called other contractors. Vendors who'd been stiffed found each other. Lawyers who had smiled at Richard at galas suddenly had file folders that told a different story. The ripple was quiet at first, then louder. The foundation's board had to answer to donors. Donors began to question. And Richard watched the dominoes fall with a disbelief that was almost pathetic. Public exposure hurt him. But the worst hits were private, personal surgical strikes designed to cut the small, soft places he loved. The first time I struck him where it mattered most, the narrative of fatherhood, was at Seymour Elementary's annual family day. He'd always loved school events. They were friendly, picturesque places where people took photos and liked the story of the benevolent man. I volunteered to help organize the bake sale. I smiled while he arrived, wearing a polo and a baseball cap, the public dad. I'd arranged for the teacher who ran the volunteer committee to, accidentally, hand over a folder to me. Inside were pages from a recent internal memo, one of Richard's, where he spoke of efficient exits and nominee liabilities, in a tone that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I read aloud, slowly, choosing my words so that parents at the tables would hear. The room shifted. Eyes darted. I kept reading until his face went ash, until his jaw clenched, until he left without a word. That day the other parents looked at him not as the man who donated art trips but as someone who had been trusted, and who had abused that trust. It was not dramatic in a viral video sense. It was quieter, more devastating. The small nods to his face vanished, conversations shortened, invitations dried up. That hum of social exile can be a slow death. For Richard it was a mirror he could no longer avoid. He tried to counterattack by threatening to take our life apart in court. He accused me of being manipulative, of orchestrating things to ruin his name. He used the legal system as a blunt instrument, but Claire had insulated me. Marcus's forensic reports were thorough and the evidence was overwhelming. He tried to intimidate the house staff, bribe them, cajole them, threaten them. I had already spoken quietly to everyone who'd been close to him, telling them gently that if they ever needed support, there were people who would stand with them. The housekeeper told me later she'd been too afraid to speak up until she heard other voices. Once one person stood, others followed. And then, the twisting part of my plan, the personal sting that would cut deepest. It involved not just the public and legal humiliation, but a sting that tied him emotionally to the consequences. He had built a life of image, and images are hard to rebuild once there's a crack. I wanted him to feel the ripple of betrayal in the places he treasured. The trust of colleagues, the warmth of neighbors, the loyalty of friends. I wanted him to sit across from someone and find their eyes cool. So I engineered a confrontation with his inner circle at a charity gala. I didn't crash the stage. I didn't yell. I let the documents do the work. I sat at a table near the head table, watched him as Claire walked in with a folder in hand, and halfway through the speeches the gala broadcast screens flickered. An investigative piece we'd arranged with the journalist played. Footage of bank statements, overlaying emails, a map of transfers. The crowd murmured. Richard tried to stand and speak, but his microphone hiccuped. Technical difficulties, someone said, sympathy in their tone. The room was suddenly cold. Chairs creaked as people shifted away. The man who once basked in applause sat like a man with no audience. After the gala there were calls. Professional consequences mounted. Board seats suspended pending review, advisory roles relinquished, and a letter from a bank about an ongoing investigation. To an outsider it looked like karma, a word I'd used in my head more than once. To me it was strategy, patient, deliberate, and precise. But revenge, even executed perfectly, does not always land as satisfaction. There were nights I lay awake afterward, feeling empty where rage had been. I'd played a part in dismantling someone's life. He had hurt me, targeted me, and tried to erase me. I fought back in ways that left him exposed. Yet when the court ordered restitution and the forensic monitor took its place in his accounts, the victory felt clinical. The wound was closed, but a scar remained, on him and on me. Still, there was one last twist I'd saved for when he thought the worst was over. He kept a private journal, a document of his thoughts and plans, a thing he'd never imagined anyone else would read. It was arrogant of him to assume privacy in a world of paper trails. I found it hidden in a false bottom in his study desk. In it were admissions, cruel assessments of women he'd used, admissions of calculated moves, a description of me not as a partner but as an asset to be leveraged. Reading that was like swallowing ice. I photocopied pages and distributed them, anonymously, to a few carefully chosen people. Former clients, a journalist who'd been skeptical, and one former lover who had felt used and cheated. The aftermath was brutal. People who'd once admired him now compared notes. He lost friendships he'd counted on like bank balances. One evening after it all, he tried to charm his way back into family life in front of Sophie. He arrived at the house with toys and overly bright smiles, calling her my sunshine. She took the toy, inspected it, and asked quietly, "Did you leave Daddy?" His face said everything, caught, ashamed, small. He had tried to hold his child's world together with purchases and polished words. But for Sophie, truth was simpler. She saw actions. She knew when someone was present and when someone was not. He had missed birthdays, recitals, quiet breakfasts. Money was a poor substitute for time. When the settlement hearings concluded, it was not a scene of triumph. Richard signed documents that removed him from certain boards, required restitution payments, and barred him from certain financial roles for a time. His bank accounts were monitored. A few of his properties were auctioned quietly to pay creditors. The man who had believed himself untouchable had to reckon with consequences. I did not dance on his ruins. I did not taunt him in the courtroom. I allowed the law to do its work and the social contracts to fray. The aftermath stung. There were lawyers' letters, angry emails, attempts to paint me as unstable, and private messages sent to old friends. He tried to use every lever he thought he had. Some people believed him for a while. Silos of denial exist in every community, and old loyalties can be stubborn. But truth, like water, finds cracks. Seeps through. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more people saw through it. Once the practical work was done, accounts frozen, settlements signed, life didn't snap back into some neat storybook ending. I had dismantled a life in order to save mine, and that left its own loss. People asked me, "Do you regret it?" And I had to be honest. There were nights I felt hollow, days I missed the naive girl who had once believed a ring could buy happiness. But those feelings were not the same as remorse for defending myself. I had been chosen, groomed, and targeted. I had fought back not out of cruelty but out of survival. There was one last small act of closure that didn't involve papers or lawyers. After everything settled, I held an art exhibit. A modest thing, a show of small canvases I'd painted in the months when sleep was elusive and my hands needed something to make. Friends came. Neighbors came. People who had supported me and strangers who had followed the story attended. Someone I didn't expect, Marcus, bought my favorite piece and told me quietly, "Paint more. People need what you make." His words mattered more than any headline. When I left the exhibit that night, I walked past a line of people talking in small clusters. I overheard someone say, "She handled it with such quiet strength." I thought then of the journey, how I had once felt powerless and how, through meticulous planning and, yes, pain, I had clawed my life back. Revenge had been the tool. Survival had been the aim. The truth is, executing revenge teaches you as much about yourself as it does about the other person. I learned that I could be patient, that I could build alliances, that I could use systems of law and public opinion to level a field that had been uneven for years. But I also learned that life after vengeance required rebuilding. There was a Hazel after Richard. Kinder in some ways, more cautious in others, painfully aware of the cost of trust. If you're listening to this and wondering if revenge is the answer to getting back what was taken, remember this. The point isn't to hurt someone for the pleasure of it. The point is to reclaim your life, to ensure the person who tried to bury you cannot do it again. The rest, the public humiliation, the legal victories, are means to that end. At the last hearing, when the judge pronounced the settlement and the monitor was appointed, Richard looked at me. For a moment, something like contrition flickered across his face. Then he looked away, and the man who had once smiled so easily could not find a smile that fit. That's when I knew I had won the only thing that mattered. The truth. The revenge was messy, expensive, and not always satisfying in the way movies promise. But it worked. He couldn't touch my credit. He couldn't quietly enjoy his life while I bore the cost. He couldn't continue the pattern of taking and leaving. I slept the first truly peaceful night months later. It wasn't triumphant. It was ordinary. Sophie woke me with a question about pancakes. She didn't need to know the details. She only needed me. And for the first time in years, I felt like the person I chose to be, not the person someone else had chosen for me. There was more to come. The legalities that followed, the awkward run-ins, the subtle social exclusions. But those were background noise to a life I was rebuilding. I had gotten my life back, messy and repaired. I had done something many people never have the courage to attempt. I faced a monster and made the world see him for what he was. If you ever find yourself wondering whether you can stand up to someone who seems larger than life, remember that giants have shadows, and shadows can be revealed in light. You can be the one to turn on the switch. When the dust finally settled, my life didn't look like a fairy tale. It looked like survival. The mansion was gone, the sparkling parties were over, and the people who once smiled at me like I was living their dream had vanished too. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid when I opened my eyes in the morning. I wasn't waiting for Richard's footsteps in the hall, or holding my breath when he picked up his phone. I wasn't pretending anymore. I was just Hazel. Richard, on the other hand, was a ghost of the man he used to be. The headlines faded, but the consequences didn't. He lost his board seats, his investors, and worst of all for him, his spotless reputation. He still had money, of course, but not power. And for a man like Richard, losing power was worse than losing everything else. I heard through whispers that he tried to start new ventures, but doors kept closing. Partners hesitated. Old friends stopped returning calls. He'd walk into rooms where he used to be the star and people looked away. His smile, once magnetic, had become a mask everyone saw through. Karma had done the rest of the work I didn't need to finish. As for me, I had scars. Not the kind you see on skin, but the kind you feel when you lie awake at night replaying every choice you ever made. I thought about the 19-year-old girl who said yes to him. I wanted to hug her, shake her, maybe both. She thought she was escaping poverty, loneliness, small-town hopelessness. Instead, she had walked into a cage lined with diamonds. But I also wanted to tell her something. You survived. You fought back. You didn't just escape, you won. Because revenge wasn't just about making him pay. It was about taking back my story. For so long, Richard had written the script. The young wife, the perfect husband, the illusion of control. But in the end I held the pen. I chose how it ended. Do I regret marrying him? Sometimes. But then I remind myself, without that mistake, I wouldn't have learned what I'm truly capable of. Without that betrayal, I wouldn't have discovered the steel in my spine. Without that pain, I wouldn't be the woman telling you this story today. If you're listening, take this with you. People who manipulate, who deceive, who use love as a weapon, they count on your silence. They count on you being too afraid, too broken, too dependent to fight back. But silence is their weapon. Truth is yours. I didn't get back the years I lost with Richard. I didn't get back the innocence I gave away. But I got something better. Freedom, strength, and a future where I'm not someone's pawn. The last time I saw him, it was by accident. I was leaving a small cafe, a sketchbook tucked under my arm, when I spotted him across the street. He looked older than I remembered, tired, worn, smaller somehow. For a split second, his eyes met mine. And do you know what I saw? Fear. Not anger, not charm, not control. Fear. Because he knew that I wasn't the girl he'd chosen anymore. I was the woman who had destroyed his game. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just walked away, my head high, and for the first time I felt completely free. So if you're ever caught in a story that feels too dark, too painful, too impossible, remember mine. Remember Hazel. Remember that even the most powerful men, the ones who look untouchable, can be brought to their knees when the truth comes out. And if you've made it this far in my story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because you never know whose story might save you next.